Much, Margaret, appreciate it. So I grew up in South Dakota, a little town called Emory, population 400. I did my undergrad degree at the Dakota Wesleyan University in Mitchell, South Dakota in psychology and math, and then of course got my PhD in Kansas and wound up here at the other Emory. And so my PhD was in clinical psychology, and I initially came into that program not really knowing what I wanted to do, but I thought, well, I could be a teacher, I could be a researcher, or I could be a clinician. Any one of those three would be kind of okay. And I started to learn pretty quickly at the beginning of all of this that I didn't really like being a clinician in the traditional sense. I didn't love working with people who were severely depressed, who weren't functioning terribly well. And then I found health psychology, where a good share of these folks were actually functioning pretty well in their lives, and then had an incident come up where they were diagnosed with cancer or terminal illness, and suddenly they were dealing with a stressor in that regard. And so kind of this idea of positive psychology wound up being very well applied to those groups of people who typically had been doing well and now are in a stressful situation, and additional hope or optimism or self-efficacy could help carry them through those kind of discrete times in life. I also like the idea of helping people with health behavior change. So people who wanted to lose weight, people who wanted to quit smoking, people who wanted to better themselves. And how could we use kind of these tenets of positive psychology to help with those goal pursuits? So I was fortunate that I was in a department where we had both the option of doing clinical health psychology, and then I also had Rick Snyder, who was kind of the author of hope theory, and so really got involved in positive psychology as a result of that. So today I'm just going to talk to you not just about hope, but about a few other kind of positive psychology constructs that really are holding water in terms of the research and their relationship with positive just life outcomes. So we'll talk about a couple from past perspective, 2 from the present, and 2 for future oriented thinking. And some of you might be kind of familiar with the idea of cognitive errors, or stinking thinking is what we call it when we're working with kids. And then we'll talk about a plug for the other side. People who know me know I'm not the most positive person in the world. In fact, I'm a pessimist, but a particular kind of pessimist. So I'll come to that in a minute. For those of you who are also pessimists, you'll probably enjoy that part of the presentation. And then just kind of ask, what good is any of this? And hopefully by then, the answer will be pretty clear. So, in terms of the past, a couple of things that I want to talk about are gratitude and forgiveness. In terms of present kind of oriented positive psychology concepts, positive affect or positive emotion, and then this idea of flow experiences, which some of you might be familiar with. And then in terms of the future, optimism and hope. And those two might sound like they are related or the same, but they're in fact quite different. So let's start with the past. The past, gratitude, a state of being grateful or thankful. And this is just a cartoon demonstrating that you can find a way to be grateful in almost any circumstance. In this case, the turkeys are really happy that Farmer Bob has been feeding them so well before Thanksgiving. And gratitude is really important. It's been kind of a major focus of almost every religion and every philosophy as a major component of health, wholeness, and well-being. And I love this quote. In daily life, we must see that it is not happiness that makes us grateful, but rather gratefulness that makes us happy. So gratitude has been known to be associated with a lot of different markers of general well-being. So in fact, it's related to greater levels of positive emotions, life satisfaction, vitality, optimism, is associated with lower levels of depression and stress, and it happens to enhance pleasant feeling states more than it diminishes unpleasant emotions. It's also been associated with prosociality, So the increased capacity to be empathic and to take on the perspective of others, as well as people with greater attitude being rated as being more generous and more helpful by people in their social networks. And in terms of spirituality, gratitude is also associated with increased spiritual involvement, and they're more likely to acknowledge a belief in the interconnectedness of all life and a commitment to and responsibility to others. And as you might imagine, it's also associated with being less materialistic, placing less importance on material goods, a decreased likelihood of evaluating success by possessions accumulated, and then also being less envious of others. And these folks happen to be better at sharing. And right before I came in here, I was lucky enough to work with a few people who were working in the area of positive psychology, and Shane Lopez was another person that had worked with Rick Snyder at the University of Kansas when I was there. He now works for the Gallup Institute, and for those of you who aren't aware, the Gallup Institute actually has an entire division that works on psychology, particularly positive psychology. Marty Seligman has been also a part of that, and he has like a school of positive psychology now. But Shane had posted on Facebook 31 benefits of being grateful. And it was really a cool kind of summary of a lot of the different findings. And when I get to hope, you know, it's kind of a laundry list. All of these things are connected to one another. So, as John F. Kennedy said, as we express our gratitude, we must never forget the highest appreciation is not to utter words, but to live by them. So, in terms of just being really practical about what I'm presenting today, I'm going to raise some questions at the end of each of these and just see if I can get you thinking about how can we possibly be applying this to our world. For example, how grateful do you think you are? So we talked a little bit about spirituality. I got married about a year and a half ago. And up until then, I would go to church by myself, and on a day-to-day basis, you know, I might remember to pray, but I don't even know what I was praying. I was probably rolling through my Catholic prayers, you know, almost automatically, not thinking about what I was saying. Now that I'm married, we've really made it a custom that each night we do our prayers, and then we talk about things that we're grateful for, things that we hope for, things that we're praying for in terms of, you know, helping others cope, or, you know, just any number of things. And I found that for me, kind of being cognizant of what I'm grateful for every day makes me a whole lot more tolerant to people too. My poor husband is a pain in my butt, but I couldn't trade him for anything. So it's one of those things where, you know, how are you going to think about this? And it doesn't mean that you have to be a spiritual person, doesn't mean you have to be a religious person, but how can you practice being grateful on a day-to-day basis? How can you make that kind of a priority for yourself? What is something you can do this week to practice gratitude? Now I'm going to move on to a second kind of retrospective way of thinking, forgiveness. And one definition is to excuse for a fault or an offense, to pardon. Another one is to renounce anger or resentment against. And I like both of these because they kind of have a different slant. One involves the experience of another, while the latter one is more about kind of your experience of a feeling. So, you know, your anger or your resentment, it's renouncing that. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the other person's experience or your interaction with the other person necessarily. And in particular, for people who are dealing with a health problem, you know, I'd mentioned, you know, terminal illness diagnoses, cancer diagnoses, there's a lot of anger and resentment that comes along with those things, and it's not really projected at anybody. So this idea of forgiveness being leveraged towards kind of life situations is actually pretty interesting. And I love this. So this is a little depiction of what it might be like to be married. Sometimes it's not easy to be thankful, and when things get tough, we often not only have a difficult time showing gratitude, but also look to others to place blame on them. And in your most intimate relationships, that's probably the case. When things aren't going well, it's hard to forgive. And I think that's why, relationships are really difficult. So the cartoon reads, "Do you promise to have and to hold grudges in sick and unhealthy ways for as long as you both shall live?" In terms of forgiveness, it's emphasized by almost every religion. And as I've mentioned before, it's not necessarily for you or for the transgressor, it's for you. And this is even more relevant in cases where there's not a transgressor, but life has just handed you something that's difficult to manage. And forgiveness actually enhances your own happiness. It doesn't necessarily have to do with anybody else. And I love this quote. "Forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. Forgiveness helps to let go of hurt and anger. It may or may not help others. It is a process that frees us to live more fully. Forgiving is not forgetting, excusing, reconciling, or being weak." And I think that's really important. And I'll talk about kind of the forgiving versus forgetting thing in about a minute. But forgiveness results in less anger and depression, less hostility, neuroticism, and vengefulness. Taking less personal offense, blaming the offender less, and offering more personal and situational understanding of the offender and of oneself. The Dalai Lama says in reference to China, "They've stolen my land and country. I'm not going to let them steal my mind." So forgive and forget. We hear that an awful lot, right? And it may be more of a forgive and or forget. So in therapy, it's really kind of an interesting conversation to have with somebody about how do you go about the process of forgiving people, but also making sure that you protect yourself. And you see this a lot with like domestic violence situations where women say, "Well, I forgave him." And it's always important to be thinking about what the role of forgiveness is versus what the role of kind of self-protection is. And you don't want to do one to the detriment of the other, right? So I think that's a very important thing to be thinking about. So when does forgiveness mean putting yourself back into a bad situation? And I would argue that it doesn't have to. You can forgive and maintain your level of self-protection. So how forgiving do you think you are? I used to think I was really forgiving, and then I realized that I was just really good at avoiding people when they made me mad. Anybody relate? Yeah. I was like, I forgive them, I just don't care for them much. I probably won't talk to them again. Yeah? And sometimes that's a self-protective behavior, right? To the extent that it serves a function and it's adaptive in the way that you're going to deal with situations, it may be an okay choice. But just be aware of when you're just avoiding because you would rather not deal with the conflict versus when you're avoiding because it's actually adaptive. And what is something you can do this week to practice forgiveness? One suggestion might be think of somebody or something that really, really hurt you. That still to this day, if somebody were going to, ask you to come up with a scenario, and I'm guessing that almost everybody just now thought of somebody that's hurt them, and it wasn't much of a challenge. Do some mental homework this week, just thinking about the amount of time that you might have been spending worrying about that person or comparing yourself to that person or wanting to one-up that person or wanting them to pay. And then think about the amount of time that you could have been spending, or that amount of time you could have been spending doing almost anything else. Helping somebody, maybe apologizing to somebody that you offended. I think that would probably flip things a little bit. My guess is it's, this question probably would have brought up something that I did to somebody at some point. And so it's humbling to think that you could have been the cause of somebody else's pain. Present. All right, now we're going to be upbeat. We just talked about getting our feelings hurt and forgiveness. Let's talk about positive emotion. So positive affect is actually the single most important active ingredient within human flourishing. It builds resilience, allows people to bounce back faster from negative experiences, and it actually buffers against depression. So what are some examples of positive affect? We oftentimes just think it's happiness or not. And that's not true at all. Positive affect could be just being calm, it could be being playful, it could be being relaxed, content, comfortable, and just being engaged could be an example of being, in a positive emotional state. Being interested. Humor, there's an entire body of literature on humor as kind of an adaptive approach to life. So positive emotions actually build personal resources and increase your well-being. They broaden the range of possible responses, so creativity. People who are in a positive mental state are much more creative than people who are experiencing negative emotions. And I guarantee you, you'll notice that about yourself and about people around you. When people get frustrated or stuck, they are really, really poor problem solvers. They can't think outside the box. It's really difficult for them to come up with ideas. And you'll see this in studies where they've induced negative emotion states versus positive and asked participants to brainstorm. Participants who are in a positive mental state are much more able to come up with an extensive list of potentially stupid ideas, but nonetheless they're being creative and they're not putting judgment on some of the ideas that they're coming up with, whereas people in a negative emotion state get stunted by kind of their criticisms of thoughts. But negativity is also important. It keeps us grounded and prevents us from engaging in kind of a Pollyanna way of thinking. And people tend to flourish when their positivity to negativity ratio is about 3 to 1.
How do you measure that?
That's a good question. They had them do like diaries of like their mental states, and they've done some kind of EMR or EMA, electronic momentary assessments, where they ask people to spontaneously report what their emotional state is. So. And this is one of my favorite quotes. A man is but the product of his thoughts. What he thinks, he becomes. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I didn't say that. Well, okay, maybe not, but you might have been thinking it, so that's not far removed from what you said. So here's a question for you. What ratio of positive to negative emotions do you think you experience? That is a tough question. On a Monday, probably higher on the negative emotion than on a Friday. On days when grants are due, I'm pretty sure I'm rocking out at about a 1 to 7. But, and it's situation specific too. And I'm sure one of the things that you all are thinking is that, it depends, right? It depends on the situation. And you're absolutely right. Pretty much every one of these kind of positive psychology measures have both a trait measure, so like a dispositional, how are you in general, and then kind of a state measure, where it's kind of like in this situation or on this specific day, how do you behave? What is something that you can do this week to engage positive emotions more often? And I'll let you sit on that one because I'm going to come back to it in a couple of minutes. I'm going to move on to the next construct because that is actually a place where most everybody engages in some level of positive emotion. And then we'll talk about some cognitive distortions or stinking thinking that can get in your way of experiencing positive emotions. So the present, we're going to move on to the idea of flow. How many people have heard of the idea of flow? All right, we have got a very knowledgeable group here. It's a mental state of operation in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized, focused, full involvement, and enjoyment in the process of the activity. And so this is based on a lot of work by Csikszentmihalyi, California. And to give you an idea of a couple of places where people tend to get flow. A lot of times people mention it in terms of like an athletic endeavor. Skiing, we commonly hear. Anything that requires a certain skill level and a challenge level, often you'll hear that. Musical performances, a lot of different situations there as well. I'll give you kind of the features of flow, and then you might be able to come up with kind of situations where you get into a flow-like situation. So in these types of situations, the goal is very clear. ski to the bottom of the mountain, hit the right notes, whatever that might be. Focused on a limited field of attention. So you basically have like a singular thing that you're involved in. And within that kind of a situation, you totally lose kind of a feeling of self-consciousness. And I think that's one of the biggest hallmarks when I'm talking to people about whether or not they reached a flow state. When you totally lose self-consciousness, that is kind of like the hallmark of reaching flow. A distorted sense of time. When you feel like 30 seconds down the slope was 5 minutes or 2, you know, you don't have any sense of time. You get direct and immediate feedback. So in the case of skiing, if you didn't fall, you did something right. There's a balance between ability and challenge, and I'm going to come back to that one because that one's really critical. There's a sense of personal control over the situation, and it's intrinsically rewarding, and you are totally absorbed in the activity. So this is a diagram of kind of where flow states tend to happen most. And you can see that when the challenge is high and your skill level is able to match that challenge, that's when you most often get into a flow state. If it's a low skill level thing and you have low skill, you're kind of apathetic about it. And then there are a lot of other kind of paradigms that can come in. Boredom, when your skill level exceeds the challenge. Or anxiety, where your skill level or the challenge exceeds your skill level. And this is a little bit more of a simplistic way to put it. Flow is essentially any time where it falls on that axis. So flow experiences, or experiencing flow more frequently, is related to greater positive affect, greater life satisfaction, greater performance, and higher levels of performance. It also leverages strengths and builds life skills, and it builds psychological capital. So Donald Rumsfeld said, "Don't over-control like a novice pilot. Stay loose enough from the flow that you can observe it, modify it, and improve it." And in flow, one of the things that I've always kind of noticed is people tend to, pay attention to like your, athletes. People choke most often in what circumstances? Or maybe it's just more noticeable. But it's kind of the high stakes circumstances, right? That's when you see people choke. And a lot of times that can be explained by the fact that they're trying to over-control something that comes naturally to them. They're professional athletes. They're the best of the best. If they were not worried about the mechanics of some of the things that they just intuitively do, they would be far better in terms of performance. Have you ever gotten into a situation like that where you were so nervous that the things that you normally would do that were totally automatic suddenly became clunky, right? Have people thought about what their flow experiences are? When do you get there? For those of you who are musical, I'm guessing you probably are identifying that as a place where you get there. For those of you who are athletes, my guess is that there's circumstances. Even writing. When I'm really interested in what I'm writing and I feel like I'm just really turned on by it for whatever reason, and I've got, the resources to be able to address it with some level of sophistication, I feel that sense of like the time flies. 3 hours are gone and I've got 12 pages written. How often do you engage in them? Remember, the more frequently you do it, the more benefit you get. How could you make some more time to actually make that happen for yourself? I know a lot of you are students. Some of you might have really high-paced jobs. Some of you are, graduate students, and God love you there too. You need to carve out time so that you can engage in some flow experiences and kind of rebuild that psychological capital. We get a lot of rejections. We have a lot of stress in our lives by the nature of the things that we do. We need to be in situations where the challenge and our skill level meet. Let's talk about the future for a minute. Optimism. It's defined as positive generalized expectancies concerning important future outcomes. And, you know, this is kind of the cup half empty, cup half full kind of thinking. So the mechanism of optimism or pessimism is really the explanatory style. It's the way of thinking about setbacks. Optimists and pessimists differ in how they see the performance and pervasiveness of bad events. So pessimists tend to see bad events as pervasive. I got fired because I'm worthless and I can't get along with people. That would be a pessimist. Optimists can fail in one domain and not generalize it to all other domains. Pessimists tend to see bad events as permanent. I failed the test because I'm stupid, something that they can't change. Whereas optimists find it temporary or changeable cause. I failed because I didn't prepare enough. Optimists tend to get better after defeat because they take that information, and if they think that it's something that's changeable and temporary, then they leverage that information well. Pessimists get worse. They might get more disillusioned by the setback. Pessimists are 2 to 8 times as likely to become depressed. Optimists live 8 to 9 years longer than pessimists. Of a group of men who survived their first heart attack, 15 of the 16 most pessimistic died within 8 years, but only 5 of the 16 least pessimistic died. And this has also been shown to impact the health of your partner. So one of the biggest predictors of your own health is the psychological well-being of the fool who married you. So choose wisely, choose wisely. And this is from Winston Churchill. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. So how optimistic are you? I'm a pessimist. I'm going to die early, and so will my husband. How often do you intentionally attend to the way that you think about the future? Do you ever think about that? Would your friends say you're optimistic? Some of you are smiling and nodding. All right, let's move on to hope. Because interestingly enough, I'm not optimistic, but I do think I'm hopeful. Definition of hope by Rick Snyder, who was my dissertation and thesis advisor at Kansas. Hope he defined as having goal-oriented thoughts, developing strategies to achieve goals, and being motivated to expend effort to achieve goals. So this is not the kind of cross your fingers and pray, hope for something good to happen. This is much more of an intentional move a proactive move on the part of the person hoping. So the 3 kind of major elements to hope theory is kind of goals. So goals that are challenging and specific, stretch goals. Having the agency, which is kind of self-efficacy, motivation to reach your goals. And then also pathways thinking. So how strategic are you? How many ways can you find to reach your goals? And typically you want at least one primary way to reach your goal and then a couple of backup plans. Hope is related to having goals in multiple life arenas, including health and fitness, higher achievement, better mental health, and including less depression, anxiety, and more positive emotion. It's related to promoting and maintaining good health, as well as preventing and treating illness. It's related to higher quality of life. And it was funny, one of the jokes in my department back in Kansas was, how many hope researchers does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer was 2. 1 to change the light bulb, and 1 to correlate that change with hope. Because everything was related to hope. You know, pain tolerance is related to hope. You know, weight's related to hope. Height, shoe size. We could find anything and we would try to relate it to hope. And William Penn said, "Never give out while there is hope, but hope not beyond reason, for that shows more desire than judgment." So we had kind of this line of research also looking at false hope. For example, there was a girl in my high school who wanted to be a country music singer. She was tone deaf. I'm sorry, there's not much you can do with that. If you're 4'11" and you're a full-grown male, you're probably not going to be an NBA player. There's just some restrictions around it. So at what point does even having these goals become false hope? And one would argue that because they don't have the strategies and the plans in place, it's not a good use of hope. It's not a good example of hope because you're lacking one of the major elements of it. So here are some questions. Do you have specific and challenging goals for the short and long term? Find a job. I'm one of those freaks who's had, life goals for every era. So by the time I finished grad school, I was supposed to have run a marathon and jumped out of an airplane and backpacked across Europe. And so my last 2 months in grad school, I did all of those things because I neglected them right until then. And that was kind of the point at which I was like, oh my gosh, and I had written it down and I had told other people that that's what I was going to do. And so it made it very real for me that, okay, I said I wanted to do these things. I'm going to be true to myself. When I realized that the first time I ever did that, I waited until the last couple of months to tackle those goals that I'd had for 4 years. It made me very cognizant of the fact that I needed to do that, and I needed to do that for every couple of years. So I've got my short-term goals, which are like, within the year, what do I want to do? I've got my 5-year goals. I know what I want to do in the next 5. And I have like I know what I want to do when I retire. It doesn't mean I can't change these things. And I've actually switched around a bunch of them for one reason or another because the opportunity came up to address something that's more on my 10-year plan, so I switch out my 10 and my 5-year plan. But I would say that this is a place where I would really urge y'all to start thinking about what you really want, because the rest of your life forms around that, right? Do you have strategies to reach those goals? And if the answer is no, if you're tone deaf and you want to be a country music singer, you might want to think about something else. Are you motivated to and engaged in reaching your goals? So some people have a goal. Some people have the ways to get there, but they can't harness kind of the motivation to do the things that are necessary for them. And it might just be a low motivation person. It might be somebody who's avoidant of kind of getting out of their comfort zone. That's one thing I would urge everybody to do. Do as many things that make you uncomfortable as possible, because it really makes you think about what you want to do rather than what's easy to do. So I want to talk a little bit about the cognitive behavioral model, because I said something about, how might you go about increasing your positive emotional state this week? And the cognitive behavioral model really highlights 3 different things and their interaction with one another. So one is kind of your cognitions or your thoughts, one is your behaviors, and one is kind of your emotions or your physiology. So if I asked you to think about your dead grandparent right now, you probably would start to feel like a physiological change. And you might even start to get a little bit choked up, and you might start to tear up. And I would call that sadness, right? Or maybe some variant thereof, right? But if I said, I want you to go and introduce yourself to somebody else in the room, smile and shake their hand, and 9 times out of 10, the person would reciprocate and smile back at you. So from a behavioral perspective, you probably just induced a positive emotion, not only for the person you just engaged, but you received one as well. So these 3 different factors really are related to one another. Typically, when we're in cognitive behavioral therapy, we focus on the cognitions and on the behaviors because those tend to be more in line with the things we can control. And then the emotional facet of it is usually a result. It's hard to say to somebody, don't be sad, because that'll improve your cognitions, but it does have kind of a cyclic effect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a different paradigm of the way that people think about things. And this is a basketball analogy, because I played ball back in the day. Very poorly, but I played. So I'm going to take you through a vignette to illustrate how a situation could be altered by what is said and done. Imagine little Johnny is playing basketball on his junior high team. The ball gets thrown to him with only a minute left in the game. He takes the risk and takes the shot and misses. The coach from the sideline uses the last of their timeouts. So, Coach A. Coach A yells at Johnny and says, "How many times do we have to go over this? What were you thinking on that shot? You let your team down in a big way, Johnny. You flub up like that again and your butt is on the bench for the rest of the season." Johnny thinking in that minute. Probably disappointed in himself, right? Probably saying to himself, "You really are stupid, Johnny. Johnny, you really messed up. I let my whole team down." What's his emotional state? Sad, ashamed, embarrassed. Might even be a little bit resentful of Coach. Behaviorally, what do you think is going to happen when he goes out on the court? We just talked about choking, right? Yeah. He's questioning his skills, right? He's going to get out there and everything's going to get clumsy. So what did Coach just do? He put him in a great position to fail if he gets handed the ball. He's in a negative emotional state, so his problem-solving skills have gone down. He's questioning every one of his skills, and he also is probably shaken and doesn't believe in himself. No self-efficacy. Now let's try Coach B. So Johnny comes to the sidelines and Coach B says, "I know you took a risk out there, Johnny. What do you think went wrong? I don't think you had enough arch on it, and I think you let the defense get in your head. Stay focused. We need you." What do you think are the consequences there? What's Johnny thinking about?
He's feeling confident.
He's feeling confident. Coach gave him a couple of concrete things, right? He said, "I don't think he had enough arch on it," right? And if he's a good player, he knows what arch is. He's probably doing, using good arch most times. He'll let the defense get in his head, right? Emotionally, what do you think is happening there for him? He might still be frustrated, right? But is he as down on himself as he could have otherwise been? And how nice is it to know that people need you? You might have got a little warm fuzzy. Now behaviorally, what happens when that kid goes back out on the court? He's just been told that we're behind you, we need you. He's been reminded to stay focused and not let the defense get in his way. Which of the, what's that?
He'll be in flow.
Exactly, exactly. So which of the two players do you think is going to probably do better out there? The second one. All right, so here's the tough question. In your life, when you're dealing with people, do you tend to be more Coach A or Coach B with them? When people mess up and they come to you, are you more Coach A? How many people are Coach A? How many people are Coach B? Okay, now with yourself, when you mess up, how many people are Coach A? How many people are Coach B? Well, good for you. I would invite us all to be more Coach B to ourselves. I think we're far more generous with other people than we are on ourselves, but there's a correlation. And so the more that you can give yourself a break, the more ultimately you're probably going to be also serving your social relationships, because you're going to be more of a Coach B with others as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about cognitive distortions or stinking thinking. These are two books that almost every clinician, has 3,000 copies and probably 6 out in circulation with patients somewhere across the globe. The Feeling Good Handbook is the one that we use typically for adults, and Mind Over Mood is the one for kids. So here are some ways that you kind of trip yourself up and get yourself into a negative emotional state. And combating these actually will help you achieve more positive emotion and more adaptive thinking just in general. So kind of this idea of all or nothing thinking, seeing things in black and white. So for example, let's say that you're on a diet. It's the new year, you're going to get fit, and you've been doing good for a while. But you came to something like this, and there was, instead of really healthy snacks like hummus and carrots, there was a bunch of cookies and cakes. and you just couldn't hold out. And then you say to yourself, I'm a failure. Every diet I've ever tried, I failed at. So this is a wash of a day. All or nothing thinking, right? Or a mental filter. You focus on a single negative detail so that your vision of all reality becomes darkened. You forget that you had almost an entirely flawless week. You'd been working out every day. You'd really been doing good with your diet. But this one place where you had a moment of weakness, you now have labeled the entire process just a waste of time. Or kind of overgeneralization, seeing a single negative event as a never-ending pattern. So, okay, I've tried dieting before, and every time I wind up getting flubbed up by a cookie. I'm never going to diet again because it's worthless and not worth my time. Jumping to conclusions is another one. So you make a negative interpretations despite no definite evidence to support the conclusion. So people do like mind reading when they conclude someone is reacting negatively to you, or they kind of do a fortune teller thing where they anticipate that things will turn out badly and feel that prediction is fact. So imagine you walk into your office one day and a coworker that's typically more or less friendly walks past you and doesn't even acknowledge you. You might think to yourself, if you're a mind reader, boy, that person's mad at me. What did I do? Or you might be thinking into the future for the day, oh my gosh, that person's going to yell at me, or my boss is mad at me and I'm going to get yelled at by that person. So that's a way that you just set yourself up for a horrible day when it might have had nothing to do with you at all. If in fact it winds up being the case that you are in trouble, you'll have those minutes to actually deal with that. But you won't have wasted the entire day waiting for something bad to happen. Disqualifying the positive. Rejecting positive experiences by insisting they don't count. So I'll have people say, congratulations, I heard you just got a new grant funded. And I'll be like, oh, I got lucky. I don't know who else applied, but it must have been a bunch of really stupid people because there's no way I should have got it, right? Magnification or catastrophizing. So exaggerating the importance of things or shrinking certain things so that you're basically discounting the good and overcounting the bad. Emotional reasoning. Assuming that your negative emotions reflect reality. I feel it, so therefore it must be true. So one of my favorite examples of this is when you say, well, I'm hurt, so that person hurt me. Well, maybe. Or maybe it was the way you interpreted the situation. 9 times out of 10, people really don't mean to hurt each other. So it's a matter of you reframing your thoughts about a situation so that you're not just justifying your negative emotional response to it. Should statements. I am the queen of shoulds. I should do this. I should do that. If I didn't do that, then I should be blamed. I should be punished. Should statements put you in a box, and they don't allow for any kind of moments to reevaluate what you think you want to do or what you might have to do. So should statements really lead to kind of like a perfectionism kind of a way of thinking about things, and not just for yourself, but for other people. And I'll say this, one of the things that I really want you to get from the message is that the more that you can work on the way that you talk to yourself, the better off you're going to do in the way that you interact with others. Because they are different, but they're really highly related, because your brain operates in a certain way that it's hard to completely shift your rules when you're dealing with yourself versus with others. Labeling and mislabeling. So extreme overgeneralization. Instead of describing an error, you attach a negative label to yourself or others, and mislabeling involves describing an event with language that's really emotionally loaded. And then personalization. Seeing yourself as the cause of negative external events for which you were not responsible. And in some ways, people who are control freaks personalize things because it's a way of them giving themselves control over everything, even though they have no control over it. They think that if they take blame for it, then they can prevent it from happening again. So this is just to go back to the idea of the cognitive behavioral model really assuming that if you can change the way that you think about things and situations, then you can also change your emotional state and hopefully get yourself to a place where you're able to experience more positive emotions, which in turn lead to more positive, and adaptive thoughts and more positive and adaptive behaviors. So we've been talking an awful lot about being positive. And how many people have heard of this book, The Power of Positive Thinking? Everybody? Almost everybody? How many of you have heard of this book, The Positive Power of Negative Thinking? This book is about being a defensive pessimist. So I told you that I'm not an optimist. I am a hopeful person, but not an optimist. Defensive pessimists set low expectations for their performance, regardless of how well they've done in the past. They think through specific negative events and setbacks that could adversely influence their goal pursuits. By envisioning these possible negative outcomes, they can take action to avoid or prepare for them. They can advantageously harness their anxiety that might otherwise harm their performance. So I have goals. I know that I want to reach them. I have absolutely no expectations that I will. But that anxiety of thinking I won't be able to, I leverage towards trying to prepare to do my best on that, and then also make sure that I don't have an investment in that outcome. So I hopefully don't get as disappointed if it doesn't happen for me. How many people resonate with that? There we go. So just so you don't think I'm trying to get you to all be Pollyanna, there's a lot of different ways of adaptively thinking. So what good is all of this? Well, I think almost across every one of the different constructs that we've talked about today, it's clear that there's better mental health, better physical health, and better quality of life just in general. I mean, any one of those outcomes seem bad? I hope not. And that's pretty much the conclusion.